what I was saying, we're going to do a lesson on microplans today, which is kind of just a simple way of knowing how to improve your position little by little without having to play for some huge long-term plan. You know, you don't have to see like how you're going to checkmate the opponent from a distance. All about just seeing a position, trying to understand what's going on, and figuring out how to just like slowly improve until you do have some kind of tactical combination or knockout that you can play for. So we're going to look at a couple of games. Let me put the first one on the board and people can start thinking about it. And these are some classics. Actually, I'm really excited to be going through these games because, oops, that's an FEN. Actually haven't revisited them in a while, and I don't think I've ever shown them on the channel, but they're really, really worth studying. This first game is a game between Nimzovich and Rubinstein. So two classic players of the early 20th century. And this was a really, really well played game by Nimzovich. I would say one of his best. So we'll be looking at this from White's point of view. So Amanda, why don't you just take a couple minutes, try to assess what's going on in the position, and yeah, then I'll ask you maybe in a couple minutes how you think White should proceed from here. So I'll mute in Discord for a sec, talk to chat, and then I'll come back to you in a couple minutes to see if you're ready. All right, folks. So it is White to play in this position. We're just basically out of the opening, and this is kind of the moment where it would be time to kind of figure out a little plan about how to complete the development, because rooks are still disconnected. We have some pieces on the back rank. We haven't completed our development, but it's also not clear how White should go about doing that. And so this is, I think, the phase of the game where a lot of players definitely start to struggle, because you choose one wrong move, one wrong plan, all of a sudden your position is weak, or you lose some critical time, and your opponent has enough time to create some serious counterplay. So let me know if you guys have a thought or a suggestion about what do you think is going on or what White should play. Paul says White is ahead in development. I think that's definitely true. White has already castled. We have 2 pieces out. We have a tactical question, does Queen A4 work? Well, I'll let you calculate and try to figure it out for yourself rather than spoiling the answer. But first thing I would check is if this knight on b4 is even hanging, and then hopefully that should clue us into whether Queen A4 is something really dangerous. Now Queen A4 B5, that's kind of an interesting idea. I wasn't thinking B5. Now B5, I would check if that move is safe, because that move might not be great. But since the knight on B4 is defended, yeah, maybe Black just goes bishop D7 and just defends with tempo. B5 would be good. The problem is bishop takes B5, and I think we're losing the exchange as Black if we take back. Might be an exchange sacrifice, but not sure that would be so nice. I think just bishop D7 and Black gets a healthy tempo. How does one get a one-on-one lesson like this? So this is still part of the redeem lessons from way back when. I'm still working through them. Amanda's been very patiently waiting, and so I'm just slowly going through the previous requests before we figure out how we'll do lessons moving forward. Okay, Falk says he would try to open up the position somehow, maybe F4, F5. Yeah, definitely a very reasonable idea. All right, Amanda, how's it going?
It's good, yeah.
Any thoughts on the position?
Yeah, so, the first thing I looked at, you said tactics. So you look at the check on A4, but I'm pretty sure it's bad because Black can save the knight by blocking it with the knight, and then that opens up B5, which would lose the bishop. So that's probably not something that you want to do. So looking at the rest of the position, I feel like the knight on B4 is pretty strong, and I would want to kick it. So
Sure.
A3 is an option. And then follow that up with b4. And the other thing is, well, I was thinking about fianchettoing the bishop because that would add a second attacker to d4, but Black does have e5, which would prevent all of that. So I don't know if that's actually good. And if you do that right away and play b3 instead of b4, then the bishop could get trapped after b5 as well. So, but the king is more exposed, so you could. I mean, I do like the idea of kicking the knight, first of all, and then maybe playing a3 and b4. But I don't know what the follow-up would be, because I don't like that pawn on d4, but it can't be attacked by any other pawns.
Right. So, yeah, actually, very reasonable idea. Actually, with the chat, we were discussing queen a4 check. Now, the first thing I mentioned actually with this one is that you want to check if the knight is actually even hanging in the first place. And since Black is defending this one, then Black doesn't even bother going backwards. Black can just safely play bishop d7 and take the tempo. But Black has to be very careful about b5, because you could play it and think that you're winning a piece, but then bishop takes b5 and White gets the rook on a8. So actually a lot of little hidden tactics with this one. Now in general, actually, I've always been a fan of this kind of like top-down approach. Like whatever position you get, you should first just look for tactics. And if we're playing a game and the opponent is not developing and just leaving the king in the center, then I'm going to be very ambitious and I'm going to be looking for how to attack. Here, I don't think Black's king is that unsafe. Black is just like 1-2 moves away from castling, and the king is safe. So I don't expect some kind of huge checkmating attack right from the opening. And so my instinct would be like yours. We're just trying to get the pieces out, connect our rooks, complete our development, and then slowly play for, let's say, small advantage or maybe a bigger advantage from there. So let's look at a3. Definitely a very reasonable idea. And then we're putting the bishop on b2. Now you mentioned you didn't like this one because of e5. But actually, if we look at this position, what e5 does is, okay, closes down this bishop. Now bishop on b2 is very restricted. But the bright side, of course, we opened up this bishop, which is kind of a nice thing. And when people talk about the power of the two bishops, this is actually kind of a nice illustration, because it's like the enemy pawns can only shut down one bishop at a time. They can never really shut down both pieces. But then the question would be, how do we get this bishop back into the game? Any ideas?
You could attack the pawn on e5. So
f4. Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's two things you can do. I think f4 is just the most natural move. You're actually like improving three pieces at once. You're improving the bishop because you're undermining the pawn chain. You're improving the knight as well because it also is putting pressure. And of course, you're improving White's rook, which really wants to coordinate with the bishop on f7. So f4, I think, very, very reasonable move here. I think you could also even play a move like bishop back to c1, just kind of like putting the bishop on this diagonal, then also following up with f4. But I think just the immediate f4 is more natural. And here I think actually White is doing very reasonably. Like all the pieces are in the game, everything's coordinated and kind of like focused on key squares together. So this is, I think, a totally legitimate approach. And I think there's different ways for White to proceed here, but for sure I would say White is better. Maybe Black should consider a move like bishop f6, but then this bishop is still stuck, and anyway White can play for f4, maybe e5, and take a lot of space in the center. Okay, in the game, Nimzovich played knight g3, which is just one of several decent moves. Black played bishop d6, and now f4. So he decides not to even, let's say, bother with the queen side. He actually doesn't believe this knight on b4 is doing all that much or threatening anything, and you can kick it with a3 at any point. And decides to play on the king side, leaving the bishop on c1, probably heading to maybe d2. Okay, reasonable idea. He's pushing his pawns forward. Black castles. And white goes queen f3. I'll just show you a couple moves how the game developed here. I should note, it also made a ton of sense for white to play e5 and then either bring the knight to e4 so you could improve the knight, or even advance with f5. Like bishop goes back to e7, white plays f5, and then tries to get a strong attack either with f6 or putting pressure. Maybe the queen comes to g4, some knight h5 ideas. If black takes, then the knight takes, and yeah, this bishop is fantastic. The rook is open. Again, we have like queen g4, bishop h6 ideas, this kind of thing. And this would have been actually a pretty aggressive way for white to play, but we'll go with what Nimzovich did. He just calmly develops. Okay, so king h8, bishop d2, and f5. So what do you think is black's idea behind this last move, f5? Why would they do this one?
So let's see well, let's look at if takes. So that just loses. Well, I mean, I guess only if you take with the knight. Well, it opened up it starts to open up the rook, so it improves the rook.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I see that the rook is staring at the queen if you can get the file to open, but that doesn't seem to make much of a difference there. You could lift the rook now. It also prevents queen g4.
Yeah, I think we're on the right track. Basically, black is fighting for space on the king side. Doesn't want to just let white advance e5 and f5 whenever white wants, or queen g4, and is trying to shut down the play. Also kind of fighting against this knight, because now if white pushes e5, white gains some space, but this knight will never be able to use the e4 square, which white would really like to do. And then if white does close the position, well, then black can say they're happy because they're not really getting checkmated. The files aren't really opening up, and white can put a rook on e1, but the rooks on e1 and f1 are literally doing very little. Okay, so now the question is, well, what should white do? So how would you proceed here?
You could well, I guess you look for the weaknesses in black's position, so the e6 pawn is backwards, right? So that's a point to attack.
Sure.
So I guess if you open up, if the e file opens up, you could put a rook on the e file, and then if takes, then you have, oh no, then that pawn's not there anymore.
Yeah, the pawn is gone as a weakness, but you're still kind of happy you got the e file.
Yeah, a rook on the file.
Okay, good. So yeah, structurally, if white has to choose between, let's say, pushing or taking, probably white wants to take to open up some lines and especially get this e file, especially because our rooks are connected and we can actually use the open file a lot faster than black can. Actually, this is a good moment to talk about these kinds of pawn breaks. This is what it is essentially. f5 is kind of a pawn break. Black is initiating some contact with our own pawn. And here you always have three options, or generally you have three options. You can advance, kind of pushing past. You can take, or you can hold the tension with a move like rook e1. As far as I know, there are no rules for always advance or always take or always keep. Just this is your decision whenever this kind of thing happens, and you have to just try to understand. Do you want to take space? Do you want to open lines immediately? Or do you want to just keep the tension? Now there's different ways to make this kind of decision. It's all about kind of, let's say, comparing the different structures and where the game could go. In the game, Nimzowitsch decides to just keep the tension, just rook a e1. And the point is that he's putting the rook on the e-file before taking on f5. So when he does take on f5, then his rook is already there. And in the meantime, it doesn't make sense for black to put pieces on the e-file because then there's no guarantee that white is taking on f5. So black is just kind of waiting. So this is the advantage of staying flexible, not immediately deciding. And if black is taking on e4, then white actually has, I think, a nice choice. You could either take with a piece and put a lot of pressure on the e-pawn, or you could also consider taking with the pawn and, yeah, trying to get the kingside pawns moving again, like e5, knight e4, and so on. So you could take this way. You could also take with the queen, I think, would make a lot of sense. And, yeah, then all of white's pieces are kind of nicely placed on the king side. And so maybe this is kind of the key detail. The fact that black is not really threatening to take means that from white's point of view, very flexible just to keep the tension and just kind of build up before taking ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so black goes knight c6. And so white wins a small moral battle here because they never had to spend a tempo on a3. Black just says, okay, you're right. The knight on b4 is not that good. I'm just going to bring it back. Okay, how to continue from here? What would you do?
Maybe take now.
Say black takes with the pawn, and then what would be our next move?
You could stack the rooks on the open file. So move this up, bring this over.
Something like rook e2, rook fe1. Yeah, absolutely. When we have like an open file, it's like very easy. I mean, very common example of like a micro plan is just like doubling the rooks on the file and just improving, and they're both coordinated. So that's the idea Nimzowitsch plays, except he just starts with rook e2. Just keeping the tension for another move because, again, not afraid of taking on e4. He can take with the queen or again with the pawn. And then possibly he wants to do this one and then take. Or take and rook fe1. Okay, so black plays queen c7. And finally white takes. Black takes. And, okay, I mean, most natural move here is rook fe1, which I think is a perfectly reasonable move, just kind of following the idea. But here white plays another, I would say, very good and useful move. Maybe I'll give you a chance to try to figure it out for yourself. What other piece could white possibly improve here, and how can they do so? And I'll mute for a sec and talk to chat. All right, chat, what are we thinking here? It's white to play. Rook fe1 is a very obvious move, but we have other options here as well. How else can white improve the position? Yeah, honestly, very impressive move here. In fact, this move is quite famous in history and made this whole game famous, in fact. I'm sure this position has been seen in many chess books at some point. Now, Paul says knight on g3 isn't doing anything. That's exactly right. Queen on f3, I would say, is pretty well placed. It's near the action. It can jump to h5 in a moment's notice. Queen d5, though, doesn't really come with any threat, as far as I can see, and black can probably just continue developing. Bishop d7, maybe b5. Okay, Falk wants to sacrifice. Knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, g4. I don't know if we're really getting enough for the knight here. I mean, the knight is worth more on the board, right, than off the board. But that is the question, guys. This knight on g3 is kind of stuck behind this f5 pawn. Or this f5 pawn from black is really restricting the knight on g3. We can put the knight on h5, but then at some point it's just going to get kicked with g6, maybe immediately. And then the knight just has to go back to g3. So, yeah. Question becomes, how do we get this knight to a better square? All right, let's check in with Amanda. All right, Amanda, what are we thinking here?
I don't know. I'm a little stumped. Okay, so going through the pieces,
Hmm.
the light squared bishop feels like it's as open as it can be. I mean, you could move it back one. Um, the knight doesn't have, I mean, the only square you can move the knight to is h5,
Hmm.
which I don't feel like is doing that much, although I don't know if there's a way where it can go from h5, not too many places. The dark squared bishop isn't doing very much, but I don't know where else it would go. So that leaves the queen. It's the queen's kind of between all the other pieces, and you could bring it to like d5, which attacks the pawn on f5. But I'm not sure what happens after bishop. Oh wait, then they just take. Then we take. So I guess
Yeah.
you could bring the queen to d5 and centralize it a bit.
So the queen on d5, yeah, this was suggested in the chat as well. Problem with this one, it doesn't come with like any real threat. f5 is
Yeah.
defended, so yeah, black maybe just goes bishop d7 or b5, and then the queen might actually feel like a target at some point. Like there's no bishop e6, but there will be a rook to d8 eventually, and then yeah, the queen might feel a little iffy. I think
Yeah.
you did spot two pieces that are really not their best. Bishop on d2, knight on g3. Actually not doing
Yeah.
a whole lot. The problem with the bishop though is that it's not like a clear way to maneuver it to like f2 maybe, but that's still not going to be that active for the bishop. And the knight on h5, you're right, advancing but not really doing a whole lot. Black can probably just play g6, and white would likely have to go back and losing time. So I'll show you the move. Nimzovich goes knight h1. Now, what do you think is the idea here?
Let's see, you could reroute. So from h1, it can go to f2,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
right here to g5. Then what after h6? That's a nice square for the knight.
Maybe e6. Yeah, I mean, well, we'll get to this moment, but definitely the knight on g5 stands really well because it coordinates with the bishop. It also coordinates with the queen. You have like queen h3, queen h5. You can target h7, and basically, yeah, just a much stronger piece, much better square for the knight. Very cool move. Actually, this move is quite famous. It's in a lot of historical chess books. I doubt it was the first time someone maneuvered a piece like this, but it was pretty nice find.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is a position like I checked it recently with an engine, and like the computer doesn't really give a clear plan for white. It just says a3 white is a little better, rook fe1 white is a little better. It doesn't actually give like a clear suggestion like here's what you should do. Knight h1 though, it's actually a very logical plan, and once white gets the knight to g5, the position becomes really difficult for black. So score one for the humans. They play much more instructive chess. Okay, so bishop d7, knight f2, black goes rook a8, and white goes rook fe1, just to keep contesting the file. And again, another one of those examples, like this is another micro plan. I'm sure Nimzo didn't have this in mind, way back when. He just got to the position and realized, okay, I need to improve the knight, and he spots a nice way to do it. So rook takes e2, rook takes e2. Black goes knight d8. The idea is to try to cover some squares like knight f7, knight e6. White plays knight h3. And here we could ask, like, what happens if black plays h6? Or on the next move, waiting for knight g5 and then going h6. And probably this is a tactic that Nimzo saw from afar, but he realized he can just plop the knight on g5 anyway, because he has this very common mating trick with the queen coming to the h file. And this is why people say tactics and strategy are always connected, because we can say knight h1, knight f2, this is a very strategic maneuver, improving the knight. But to make it work, you have to see the tactical idea that the knight can't be taken. Otherwise, if you thought, oh, h6, the knight is just going to get kicked, like if white had to move backwards here, then this whole thing would be totally pointless. So very important, always kind of keep these, well, to stay concrete and always be looking for these kinds of tricks. Okay, so black, yeah, doesn't want this, because then the knight just kind of lives here on g5, and then white has a very simple plan of like queen h5, queen g6, which is very scary, threatening mate on h7, and then forcing or asking black to take the knight, and then dropping back with the queen and checkmating on h5. So black plays bishop c6, gets the tempo, queen h5, g6, queen h4, and king g7. So just kind of improving the king. Then if knight g5, black can play h6 and deal with the threat. Now Nimzo goes queen f2. He does a little funny little maneuver here. Black plays bishop c5, and he goes b4. And so black is, okay, trying to defend the pawn, so he plays bishop b6. Like, what else, right? Well, now he goes back, queen h4. And all of a sudden, there's no bishop covering the e7 square, and white just has this huge threat of rook e7. So, very funny trick, actually. It plays like queen f2, targeting the pawn. Black defends, like, okay. It goes b4, just hitting the bishop. Bishop drops back, and then queen h4, and all of a sudden, now black has this huge weakness to defend. And one of the, unfortunate things about bishops is that when they're on one side of the board, they have a hard time getting to the other side. And as far as the king side is concerned, like, this bishop is just not there anymore, not defending any squares. Incidentally, had black just given the pawn and played something like bishop e7, let's say white takes, and then black goes bishop f6, and then white drops back. Here black has lost the pawn, but then this bishop would actually just be totally dominating the king side, just controlling all the dark squares, controlling this whole diagonal. Okay, white has this extra pawn, but like, yeah, it's going to take a lot of effort to push it. Which is a hard thing to do. Most players, they don't like giving up pawns if they feel like they don't have to. But this is all about kind of like sensing the danger and realizing that it's actually a bigger problem for black if the bishop isn't stuck on or isn't defending the king side. But okay, let's continue. So bishop e6, queen h4. Black goes rook e8. And white plays rook to e5. So he keeps the rook. The rook is defended, but what's the idea if black takes twice on e5 here?
Then this diagonal is open. You could give this check.
Mm-hmm.
What does that do?
Yeah, let's calculate it out.
So I think you would want to give it, well, maybe you give it with the bishop. So what happens, because if you give it with the bishop, then the queen's defending this square. So the king has to go to, okay, well, then this is being defended by, so the king has to go back to the corner.
Good.
And then queen, king, bishop, but this square is not defended. You could still put the knight here, and then there's the idea of like bishop check and queen up.
Okay, kind of getting a little deep now, right?
Yeah, the king's in trouble. Lots of arrows.
No, but that's fine. Yeah, you don't have to, let's say, calculate it out all the way through. If you just feel like it's a strong attack, that's an evaluation that you say, okay, looks like a strong attack, and I'll win it. I'll win it from there. Because the danger is, it's of course very easy to miscalculate when you're looking from afar. Okay, and then let's check the other possibility. So we could give check on h6 with the bishop. Now let's check with the queen. What happens there?
You check with the queen. So now the king can go. Well, I guess the king doesn't want to go here, right? Because then the bishop comes in and that's mate. So queen. Oh, then maybe the king has to go back to the corner. And then the knight comes in and that threatens checkmate. But it can be defended.
Yeah, I like White's position there. I just want you to pause after King H8 and really try to visualize that position and treat it like a puzzle. Like White to play, try to find the strongest move.
The rooks are off the board. The pawn is off the board.
Queen F8, very good, very good. Okay, nice job. That was a good visualization. And so you can actually see the full line. Like starting with, okay, he probably had to calculate it from here, but one move is not that much more. But yeah, well done. And so again, it kind of shows, all right, tactics and strategy are like always connected. Because why does White want to play rook e5? Because he wants to just keep the rook active. He doesn't want to just trade and allow Black to take on e8. But in order to make this move, you do have to kind of justify it with calculation. Because of course, many players see this move, or they don't even consider it very deeply. They just see like, okay, I lose a pawn, so not that move, right? I shouldn't do that one. But if you can always try to look a little bit further and try to justify these moves, it can be very, very powerful for your game. So
Yeah.
rook e5. Black plays knight f7. And yeah, let's continue. How should White play?
Well, the rook's now being attacked, so I don't think we want to lose the exchange here. Right, because that doesn't. Well,
You can certainly consider if that's an actual threat or not. You're allowed to ask that question. Like, is Black actually threatening, or can we just leave the rook indefinitely?
so if Black takes a few times, then do we have the same threat? So this line has been opened. We still control this square, so king has to move back, and still nothing's defending. So I think we can leave the rook.
Mm-hmm.
So what to do now? Well, what if this? Then we've got some attacking ideas here with this check and a pawn on g5. So black's not going to want to take. Would we want to take if we... I mean, we could bring the knight up anyway. There's also the idea of like, well, that's not going to work right away. But pushing the pawns on the queen's side, returning back to the queen's side, and maybe attacking these bishops. But I do like the idea of bringing the queen to g5 anyway, because it's not really doing much on h3.
We would love to get this knight on g5. I mean, we worked so hard, knight h1, knight f2, knight h3. It is a bit of a pity that on knight g5, though, black can just trade it off immediately. Like, we'd spent so much time to get here, and then black trades off, and then we have to be careful. fg, of course, black can still take the rook with the queen, and we don't have the same mate as before. So on knight g5, we would probably have to take back with our own queen to keep the rook defended. But then, yeah, we kind of lost our, like, one of our most important attackers, or at least we really wanted this knight on g5 because it looks so strong. So how can white try to make this happen? How can we actually get our knight to g5 here?
Well, if we decide that the knight is stronger than the bishop, in this case, we could take it and then bring the knight to g5. I don't see another way to attack the knight.
Yeah, well, let's look at this one. What happens after bishop takes f7?
Well, it would have to be queen takes. Because if king takes, then I don't think that looks good. Then just queen h7 and things start to get a little dicey. Sure. So queen takes. Then, okay, well, so what if, there's nowhere that the queen can move that also defends h7?
There's one square.
Let's see. Oh, right, because the bishop's not there.
Yeah, exactly. So queen g8, black would have to play.
Queen g8.
Yeah, kind of a passive move, right? Just putting the queen all the way on the back rank. But then still, it would be a matter of whether white can really find a way to continue from there, because white is giving up. I mean, light square bishop is also a pretty important piece.
Yeah.
But let's take a look. So he does hack on f7. Queen takes. Knight g5. Queen g8. And yeah, now it's like, it's kind of interesting position. I mean, we've had some trades, but black's king is still quite vulnerable, quite exposed. There's a lot of weaknesses around the king, especially because of the dark squares. If we put this bishop on f6, then I would say black is doing pretty well. The bishop is just defending everything. But again, black's bishops look nice on the queen side, but actually when it comes to the king side, do very little. And so here white starts fighting for on the dark squares, which of course makes a lot of sense. White has a dark square bishop, and the knight as well can also fight on the dark squares, or at least support it. I really like how he proceeds here. So rook takes c8. Black has to take with the bishop. And now let's think for a sec, how should white continue here? Let me give you a couple minutes to think about it, and I'll come back to you. All right, folks, so white's at play. How should we continue the attack here? This position is again all about improving the pieces. You can call it a micro plan. The next sequence, I think it kind of makes sense. Now, knight e6 check is covered. Black's queen is eyeing that square, so we got to be careful. Looks like Amanda's looking at b5, which actually does make sense because it opens up white's bishop. Ah, I see, Dirk. I see. Yeah, by all means. All right, Seth wants to go g4. Oh, this position, huh? ASV? That's cool. Yeah, I can see how it would make it into a combination book. That makes sense. g4 if you're going to get crazy. Yeah, knight takes h7. That's an interesting try. Queen takes, queen e7 check. Then maybe bishop f7 covers the check. Dirk and Thorbidals both like queen e1, bringing the queen. Seth likes queen e1 as well. All right, Amanda, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that, like, knowing that the dark squares are open, I'm seeing that the dark squared bishop's staring into 2 pawns right now. And it would probably be of more use attacking the king. So yeah. I'm trying to think of, like, how to do that. So my first thought was, okay, if you push this pawn and then black takes, then you could move the bishop here. But if black pushes, then they take away this square. And you can't get... I feel like I want to get the bishop over to like maybe e7, and then you move the knight and threaten this check. So the only other way to get the bishop out is to bring to c1, a3, and then maybe push, and then there's nothing that black can do to stop the bishop from opening.
Uh-oh. Our connection froze for a sec. Wait a bit until Amanda gets back. But yeah, she's talking about opening up the bishop, which makes a lot of sense for this position, because this is, yeah, definitely a piece that white wants to include. Oh, are we back?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, cool. Yeah, so I was just saying b5 makes a lot of sense because we would much rather have this bishop actually active and controlling some squares, and it's well worth the cost of the pawn if it means we get something like bishop d6, bishop e5, bishop e7, and it's like we're just attacking with an extra piece, and that would be really nice for white. As you pointed out, the problem is e5. Black can really slow white down on this plan, and then if bishop c1 here, maybe bishop c5 if black really wants to close this idea. And if we try bishop c1, bishop a3, it does feel a little bit slow, and that black will have time maybe to bring their own bishop back and play h6, something like that. So keep this idea in mind because we will need the bishop at some point. White played queen e1. I don't know if you consider this move, but just seeing it now, what do you feel is the idea here?
You could... Well, what happens with this after this check? Because now, so before I looked at that check, but the square wasn't defended, so the queen could take. But now, okay, so this is made.
Yeah.
Where can the king go? I mean, not really here. I guess it can go. So probably the king goes to f7 after that check, because I mean the corner, then the queen comes up anyway, and right, anything on this diagonal.
Yeah. Now let's wait up before we calculate knight e6 check, king f7. too deeply, what might be some other moves that white would consider if we get another move in this position? Yeah, we have queen e7 check. What else? Queen e5 check. Yeah, absolutely. These two queen checks are also actually very annoying for black, and then maybe followed up with knight e6 and bringing in the knight as well. So this move is actually all about just kind of like switching targets. It's one of the harder moves to play when you're attacking. I mean, it looks like the queen is quite nicely placed on h4 and it's very active, but black is defending this one weakness here, and now basically what white is doing is just switching targets, playing for new weaknesses, and it's just very difficult for black's pieces to cover all of these squares at once. So we always want to be looking for these kind of like rerouting moves when we try to, especially if we can infiltrate with our heavy pieces, very dangerous for the enemy king. Okay, so queen e1, black is in big trouble here. Bishop c6 is tried, queen e7 check, and black plays king h8. Queen e5 was also interesting. I think knight e6 was also interesting. I do like bringing in the queen. And okay, white to play. How would you continue from here?
I mean, let's see. Let's calculate this.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously if queen takes, then we take the queen and win.
Mm-hmm.
So the only other move is king here, and then we have discoveries. Well, then we have a discovery here.
Okay, we got to be careful though, because knight f7, king g7, knight h6.
Then, then the king takes the knight.
King can take, yeah.
Yeah, so not that one. What happens after this one? Then the king moves back to the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help us? We could take the bishop and then pawn takes, but that doesn't seem, the knight's so strong we don't want to give it up.
Yeah, but let's do a visualization exercise. So let's try to calculate this line. So knight f7 check, king g7, knight e5 check, king goes back to h8. Then let's say we do play knight takes c6, bc6. And then from there, white to play and win. Let's say puzzle rush style. That's close. There's going to be a pawn on c6.
There's a pawn. Oh.
Right, but yeah, when you play one of these checks, black is going to have to go queen to g7. So it's all about this hanging bishop on b6.
So, okay, let's see. Queen e5, queen g7, queen.
And queen b8 picks up the bishop. Yeah, very nice. That's like it's a lot of moves. Check, check, takes, check, and picking up the bishop. A 5-move combination to win the piece. Very nice. Nimzo missed that one, actually. Embarrassing for him. He didn't find it. He had a different idea in mind. I mean, to be fair, at this point, white's position is very good because black's king is just super weak. White is attacking with like an extra piece on the king side. And his idea, actually, he wanted to play knight e6 because this threatens direct mate with queen f6 check. Immediate queen f6 is not as good because black goes queen g7, and then white doesn't have such a great follow-up here. I think people are asking about this one in the chat. So he wanted to play knight e6, threatening this. Black's only defense, I think, would be to go h5. And then queen f6 check, king h7, knight g5 check, king h6. Black's king is just surviving just barely. And then he gets this like typical, chess player thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could do this and this? And he probably considered this move b5 to open up the bishop, just like you did earlier when you wanted to get the bishop to this diagonal, except here, okay, it's quite forcing and hitting the bishop on c6, and then you can get the bishop to f8 with mate. So with that in mind, he kind of does a typical, let's say, thinking technique, and he just starts with the clearance idea right away, just throwing in b5. Not the only way to win. Actually, I think knight f7 check was also just as good, but okay, nice, a nice finish to the game, because now this one comes with tempo, so black isn't able to play a5, which they would very much like to play. And if they take with either piece, then yeah, knight e6, the same combination now works, but it's kind of more efficient from white's point of view because he already forced black to play this one, and now bishop b4, and this is just just ending in mate for black's king. Let's say this here, here, and what would you play for white in this position?
I feel like I'm missing something.
Knight h3? Yeah, just threatening mate, right? Yeah, I mean, actually, any knight move is good here. Knight h3, knight f3, knight e4. Basically, okay, we just have to find a way to finish off the king, and that's it. So not a necessary idea actually, but okay, pretty nice. We call this a clearance sacrifice, where we clear a diagonal for one of our pieces. And actually, remember you had this idea earlier, right, in an earlier position. This often happens when you maybe consider an idea. At one point, it doesn't quite work, but then you kind of keep it in the back of your mind, and then it shows up later on under better circumstances. Very kind of common situation.
I just instantly forget them all, so
That can happen as well. But yeah, it's good to kind of, I don't know, just keep the ideas in mind. So after b5, okay, black didn't want to get mated, tried to grovel with queen to g7, but white simply took, wins the piece on c6, and quickly converted this endgame with the extra piece, starting with knight f3, and then bringing the knight in, and yeah, black never really had much of a chance in this endgame. So that was basically it. But very nice game. A lot of like really nice maneuvers, I thought, just starting with like knight g3 and f4. Then of course building up bishop d2, rook e1. And then of course this very famous knight maneuver now, knight h1, bringing the knight to g5. This was really what kind of facilitated white's attack. Of course activating the queen as well. Then this nice little mini plan of like queen f2, bishop c5, kind of provoking black to leave the bishop on b6, and then returning with the queen now to dominate the king side. And then rook e5. So you can see like just a number of like little combinations throughout the game, some tactics that white had to see. But it was always just about kind of like improving the pieces, looking for weaknesses, looking for targets, and yeah, finding a way for our pieces to kind of attack the critical squares. Then the exchange was very important, bringing the knight to g5. And then maybe this final move, one of the most important in the game, queen e1, just finding a way to like maneuver the queen, improving the strongest piece in the position to just totally decimate black's dark squares. So yeah, really classic game. Always like this one. And you did great, Amanda. Great work. I hope it was useful for you as well.
yeah, thank you so much. That was very helpful and definitely, was most of my weaknesses, because I feel like you're right, where sometimes I just get stuck and I'm like, I don't know what to do now, and then usually lose.
Right. Well, it's good to hear. I mean, okay, this was just one game, but yeah, just some brief takeaways. It's yeah, if you don't have like a direct, let's say, attack in the position, it's always good to kind of evaluate what your pieces are doing. Can you improve them? Good thing is to think about, like what would be the best square for this piece, and then is it actually possible to get there? And then always important to look at the opponent's weaknesses as well. Like what can you target? What can you put pressure on? How can you slowly build up? Okay, I had another game planned, but I think that's probably good for today. If you like, we can do this again with another game that I think would be really helpful, not just for you, but for chat as well. Okay, for now, that's gonna do it for the lesson. Thanks for joining me.
All right. Awesome.
All right, have a good one. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.